Thanks very much for participating in the conference. I'll start by saying that we are very grateful to the participants for the enthusiasm you've been showing, because in all honesty, we did not expect such a large and such a prestigious attendance, really. By the way, I'm Alinas, you might guess. Some of you know now. Just a moment ago, I was asking Professor Linus Prikopy how should I introduce him, and he advised that I make it short, like a bit short. So I would like to ask Professor Prikopy, who is the Chancellor of the University and the former head of the Ministry of Research and Education, to address a few words to us.
Even though someone might be in the situation to hear me again on the same idea, I will state once again, it's very nice to be rector in Romania, because if you have a little bit of skills in public communication, in providing speeches, everything is excellent. So daily you have to have a speech, and the structure of the speech is clear. First of all, welcome all of you here in Bucharest, in CNSPA. This is the first part. The second part is to say something about the university. And once again, it's a pleasure to speak about this university, and it's not just a pleasure, but I am very proud to speak about CNSPA. CNSPA is the acronym of National University of Political Studies and Public Administration. Why I'm proud of this? Because I think this university is established, state university, established 26 years ago, in January 1990, immediately after the revolution, had a mandate at that moment from the government to help this country to build the new democracy. And being an educator, not just once, many times, I have reflected on the idea of the university, what is a university and how you can measure the results, the added value, the outcomes of a university. And I think the best way to do this is to look at the graduates. Sure, professors are important, research grants are important, papers, books, students and so on, but in fact, especially considering our profile, when you look at the graduates, you can have an idea if you have completed or not your mission, and what will be the challenges for the future. And considering that this conference was opened by a former student of us, Alin, I think even in semiotics, we have reached our objective, having graduates working on this, not just in Romania, but also in other countries. In this topic, I underline once again, it's for those who doesn't know exactly what CNSPA is. In a couple of sentences, CNSPA has succeeded in these 26 years since it has been established to contribute not just to the development of Romanian democracy, but also to contribute and to shape somehow, or to contribute to the shaping of different policies at regional or European level. We have graduates working in Brussels, working at NATO, working at United Nations. We have a lot of graduates being ambassadors, and it's a matter of being proud, not me particularly, but our CNSPA community. The third component of my speech today will be about the event, semiotics. Semiotics for me, sure, semiotics means a lot of things, but for me, this word will lead me to Professor Borsun, because he was my professor, and here in CNSPA 20 years ago. And I discovered this topic without being a specialist in semiotics, but the topic was introduced to us 20 years ago by Professor Borțun, and I'm very happy today he succeeded once again to put together a team and to organize this conference under the umbrella of CNSPA, but in close collaboration with our partners from UK and the International Association of Semiotics. Why it's important, this topic for us, the School of Government? I think the answer is very clear, because when we speak about communication, about public communication, we have to look at different aspects. And I would dare to say the way we approach public communication theoretically and from the research point of view, it's a specific one here in CNSPA, and Professor Borțun has played an important role in this. Last night, Professor Borțun provided me the fourth chapter of my speech through text messages. So I have, because you know a rector doesn't do what he or she wants, we have to do also what we have to do, and Professor Borțun underlines that. Alin Olteanu, Sorin Dragan, Bianca Cheregi, Liliana Voicu, Paula Dragan have played an important contribution to this event, and Professor Borțun considers that if the rector will say thanks to all of this, it will be more important. I think it's enough to say thanks for their work, never mind who is saying this, but on behalf of our institution. The final word, and I'll come back to our partners. I understand you are from the first time in Romania, and I would like to underline a little bit what we are trying to do in terms of increasing the international dimension of our teaching, research, different other projects. CNSPA, sure, started 26 years ago with a very national objective. But I would say today there is a conflict between the name, because I said the name is National School of Political Science and Public Administration, because step by step we started to cover other areas. For example, we have graduates from Moldavia, we have students from different countries in Europe, we have Erasmus students today from Brazil, Mexico to China, taking advantage of Erasmus Plus, a project which was not very easy to introduce. You mentioned my position in the ministry for 2 years. In Brussels, we fight it to have this Erasmus Plus and to have the possibility to work together at the academic level, not just within the European borders, let's say, but much broader approach. We are trying, and I hope we'll be successful in the next years to increase the number not just of students, Erasmus or other kind of students attending our courses, but also we are trying to increase the number of professors, the number of international partners on different research. This morning I just signed another agreement with Eurache. Eurache is an association at the European level of higher education, on which the College of Communication has an important contribution. So, for the first time here in CNSPA, as co-organizers of this conference, but we hope you or your colleagues from the university or from the International Association of Semiotics will come here for shorter or longer periods of time to teach. We have had in the last 20 years, each year, a Fulbrighter as our professor receiving a Fulbright grant, and in the last years we started to have Fulbright professors from the United States coming to teach here, or Erasmus mobility professors coming to teach here for a short period of time. So I'll conclude with this invitation to reflect on the idea to return at one moment and to meet for a longer period of time, not 2 days, our students and our professors. Thank you very much, and once again congratulations for Professor Borțun and for the College of Communication to organize something like this. The last component, all the time, it's part of my speech, the rector will say, due to the agenda, I have to leave. This time, I'll not leave. I'll stay with you to hear, and after that, after your speeches, I leave. Thank you very much.
You're all aware, this year the semiotic academic community is grieving two losses, namely Professor Solomon Marcos, who is the honorary president of this conference, passed away, and his good friend and great scholar Umberto Eco as well. On that note, I would like to ask one of our other organizers, Professor Paul COBLEY, who is the president of the International Association for Semiotic Studies, to address a few words about the International Association, of which Umberto Eco was one of the founders, and also our beloved Professor Solomon Marcos.
Good morning. Just a few words from me about these two massive figures in our intellectual life, particularly in relation to the International Association for Semiotic Studies. Umberto Eco was a founder, and he was an officer for some years of the International Association, and of course, I tell everybody that he was my predecessor, but I didn't actually know Umberto Eco. I was only introduced to him once and never got to speak with him at any length, because I think he was involved in Italian cultural issues and was writing his novels. But hopefully my paper will be able to give some tribute to Eco and what he contributed to the field and to intellectual life in general. So I will be referring to Eco in my paper this morning. Solomon Marcos, by contrast, I knew rather well, and I saw him many times in the last 20 years. He seemed to be everywhere. He was at every conference in semiotics that I went to. And he was a major player, not just in giving formal papers, but he spoke to everybody who gave a paper at congresses, and sometimes he didn't listen because he was profoundly deaf, and he often said to me, "I'm not going to listen to your paper. I can't understand native English speakers." And so he didn't listen to my paper. But funnily enough, if I ever mentioned football or tennis, he was able to follow every word of what I said. And that's quite characteristic of Solomon Marcos. An interdisciplinarian, a hard worker, an extremely sociable person, a fantastic ambassador for semiotics. And above all, as I said before, he was ubiquitous. And so the fact that he's not here now, and he won't be in other places as well, is a great sorrow to me and to many of his colleagues who I know are assembled here today as well. So thank you, Professor Marcos, and my thanks to Eco for being able to argue this morning.
Thank you very much for those very nice and kind words. On that note, I just have to mention, when somewhat ironically I first met Professor Marcos in Imatra in Finland, so we were sharing a cab from the train station, which is, if you've been to Imatra, you know that the train station is in the middle of nowhere. So I met Professor Marcos there and we were sharing a cab. I was trying to seize the opportunity to first have a conversation with Solomon Marcos and ask him about what he meant on book, whatever, page 275. his only concern during that taxi ride, his question to me is if the tennis is on the TV. To move on, I did mention we are very grateful to all of you and very happy that we managed to attract such a large and prestigious gathering of academics. We have some numbers over here provided by the university, 94 authors, 50 institutions, 29 countries, 5 continents. And with this, we exceeded the, it's a good thing that Dario is not here yet. We exceeded the records of the International Semiotics Institute. Professor Dario Martinelli, the head of the institute, was very distressed, was puzzled that Congress is never managing to attract anyone from Southeast Asia or Australia or Oceania. And we have one participant from that part of the world. She's sitting somewhere over there and called Carla. Thank you very much for coming from so far away. I'm back in my hometown, which means that this morning I had, of course, an argument with my mother about what shirt I would wear. And I was very close to wearing that shirt, which you can see over there. My mother was insisting that I should wear that shirt. In that embarrassing it wear, I would be wearing the same shirt as in the photo. I went for my decision. Leaving my silly jokes aside, I would like very much to thank my colleagues. Professor Borțun was mentioned before, and the president of the scientific committee of this conference. Sorin, where are you, Sorin?
I'm here.
He's over there, who did an absolutely amazing job at doing the most difficult tasks required in organizing the conference. He managed to obtain the funds needed for this conference, and he did most of the administration work together with the help of his beloved wife Paula, who is with us just over there. Thank you very much, Paula. Certainly not last, Beata Kennedy, who's also done an amazing work, and you might already be familiar because you've been corresponding to her since you were attending this conference. Thank you very much. We'd also like to thank our sponsors. Without them, certainly the conference would not have been possible. Maybe Chin Market, Linda Soft Business, and Tipo Printing House, as well as a few persons who particularly were engaged with supporting this conference, namely Iona Sanda, Tomescu Cristian, Sveka Aura, and some other institutions such as Interland Hotels and Sky AMA Medical Center. Before I move on to discuss about, before I move on and introduce our next speaker, I would like to mention that there will be, this conference will require a very intensive, suppose it's a very intensive schedule. We have a lot of speakers. Therefore, I would like you to take a good look on today's schedule, and please note if you are a chair or if you are maybe giving a keynote speech today at some point, please be there on time. And I would like to kindly ask the chairs, the moderators of the sessions to be strict and merciless with their speakers, because we have to respect the timing. Each speaker has about 30 minutes. If the session has 4 presenters, or about 26, 27 minutes in the session contains 5 presentations, 5 papers. And certainly not last, I would like to ask Professor Andrew Staples to address a few words to us. As you know, CNCPI is the main organizer of the conference, and the conference is being organized by the International Association for Semiotic Studies, and the other institutional organizer of the conference is Roehampton University. Professor Andrew Staples is the head of research of the School of Education at Roehampton University, and as such, he's one of the main organizers of the conference. I myself, as a representative here of that university, And we will have some more attendees from Roehampton University. I would kindly like to ask Professor Seibel to tell us a few things about Roehampton's input into the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Welcome, everyone. Great pleasure, a privilege for us at the University of Roehampton in London to be part of this. Roehampton is one of Britain's newest universities in its own right, but parts of it have been higher education institutions for 175 years, so it's also one of Britain's oldest universities in a sense. It's a largely arts and humanities-based university, and also really quite research intensive for such a relatively small new institution. But of course, the efforts we had to put into this conference have been extremely minimal, except for those efforts of one person, and that's Aline himself. And I know that Aline was one of the people whose ideas resulted in this conference, and the whole university is benefiting from his efforts. Ali's been a pioneer, really. I have worked with him for the last 6 years, since he started doing his PhD at the University of Bath. And he, in a sense, because there are no departments of semiotics in Britain, and there are very few courses in semiotics in Britain, no entire degree courses, I don't think. What Alan has been doing is pioneering in a national sense, as well as working on his own work. So it's a great privilege for us. Thank you for having us. Thank you, Aline. Thank you all of you for coming.
Well, do forgive me, Andy's tragically wrong. He is by far the pioneer, not me. Thank you very much. And I guess we will now have a coffee break, if I'm not mistaken. No, I am mistaken. Forgive me.
We have the first plenary
session. Yeah, I was really looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
So from one pioneer to another. So now you will have met the entire selection of pioneers in semiotics in the UK at the moment, probably. There we are. A huge pleasure to welcome Professor Paul COBLEY, who, as you probably know, is Professor of Language and Media at the University of Middlesex in London. But better known to most of you still, President of the International Association of Semiotic Studies, and has long comprehensive background and overview in semiotics. So really, I think as soon as he feels able to start, as we're a little tiny bit behind schedule, we should start and welcome Professor COBLEY. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, organisers. I'm delighted to be in Bucharest for the first time, and I'm pleased to be here speaking to you. When we get invited to these kinds of events, one of the things that you're required to do in your paper, now I don't wish to anticipate the papers of other plenary speakers, but one of the things I think that you're required to do is to be synoptic, and that's probably what you can see in my title. I'm going to present something on code and semiosis, and in fact, the issue that I'm addressing is so fundamental that it might seem overly familiar. Hopefully I'll be able to say something new about it, but certainly it's an issue that I think is central to the work that we're doing in the International Association as an organisation dedicated to furthering the aims of semiotics, and hopefully you'll see something of that flavour in this paper. Okay, now for the cameras, I have to remain here shouting through this microphone, but usually I like to walk up and down and shout as if to students. So if this paper seems extremely dull, it's because I haven't got that tactile element to my presentation, and that's the only reason why it might be dull. Okay, so these fairly familiar issues, I can see that this slide is already off kilter compared to the one that I proposed, but nevertheless, we're considering the continuity of semiosis on the one hand, and the idea of systematic patterning in semiosis through this notion of code. Really, I would like to address this issue, and I do this implicitly in what follows, through the notions of continuity and invariance. A bit of advertising, I've just written a book called Cultural Implications of Biosemiotics to be published by Springer next month. I hope more than 2 or 3 people buy it, but if 2 or 3 people buy it, I would be extremely pleased, because that's more than forecast. But going through the book is this notion of the conflict or the complementarity of continuity and invariance. If you think back to the beginning of semiotics, everyone knows that Hippocrates is the father of semiotics, but one thing that strikes me in thinking about the International Association, but also thinking about our field, our disciplinary field as a whole, is that originally when Hippocrates was making his diagnoses and sometimes prognoses, it must have felt to the people receiving those or spectating on those that it was like magic. That what Hippocrates was doing was not so much science, but the reading of omens and the practice of divination. This idea, I think, in mystic thought and in magic is quite a prevalent one. This is Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below. And in that slogan, as above, so below, you've got a sense of systematic patterning on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got the idea that there is a connection between all living things, and that connection is to be sought out by magic. I mention this because, as all of you will know, in the 1970s and in the early 1980s in Europe, semiotics was extremely fashionable. It was very fashionable, well beyond the academy, making impact in the way that is required of academics today. Okay, but the problem with being in fashion is that you go out of fashion. And we've been struggling with the consequences of going out of fashion since the early 1980s. It hasn't stopped us doing our work, but certainly in some respects it's been an impediment to our achieving of impact. And I think one of the reasons that we went out of fashion was because when we were in fashion, it seemed like magic. What we were doing was a magical trick in revealing aspects of textuality that had previously not been considered by the general public. Okay, once you learn how to do the magic trick, once you learn how to do that, it ceases to be magical. Okay, so I think that's part of our heritage in semiotics. And I think when the notion of continuity turns into systematic pattern, turns into codes, and in the sphere of magic, it does so through divination. This means that. This means that the following weather will occur. This means that the following event will take place. When you get coding, you're on the first stage of having what might be deemed simple magic tricks that could be learned. Historically, we can see that happening with the notion of code in the period of the early to late Renaissance in Europe, Trithemius an alchemist, used the concept of code quite consciously. In the Elizabethan court in England, John Dee was practiced in codes, and in fact, he informed Francis Walsingham, who was one of the first spy masters in European civilization, and he worked not exclusively but predominantly through coded messages in order to protect the Elizabethan court. They were drawing on a long history in Europe, in Greek and in Roman thought to do with cryptography. And we see in this illustration the citily on the left, which is a message wound around a stick, and it can only be read when it's wound around the stick. It's just one long strip of meaninglessness when it's not. And then on the right there's one of the simplest of codes, but one of the most predominant in Roman times, the Caesar code, okay, which is one letter corresponding to another. Cryptography, I think, is the major heritage frame, I think, for our understanding of code. And it's cryptography in a way which has been instituted in modern maths and computing. Singer calls it the mechanizing of secrecy. With the advent of electronic communications, particularly in the 19th century, you got code being utilized in more instrumental ways and less for the mechanization of secrecy. This illustration, of course, is a telegraph. And then in the 20th century, of course, there's an extensive study which is dedicated to coding. And I show here as a somewhat problematic exemplar of the whole of communication study in the 20th century, but I'm conscious that I have to move on. Gertner's model from 1957. And if you look at this, you can see that what is happening with Gertner's model, which is typical of a lot of, being very synoptic, typical of a lot of communication theory, is that something in the real world is transformed, specifically in this instance, through channels of communication, through different access to channels, and through processes of selectivity which are dictated by those channels. And in particular, Gertner's model is one which is conceived for students of medium. Okay, so it's very much a coding model, and I suppose the key criticism of Gertner's model is that it's overly insistent on coding at the expense of sociological factors. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that I would probably teach undergraduates when we were doing this topic. Okay, but as an illustration of the trajectory of communication theory in the 20th century, I hope it works. I show you this because this is typical of that kind of modelling of code. But let's hope it's not too typical, because as you can see, there's a sign which relates somehow to a code, which somehow relates to paradigmatic patterns, and then there's some syntax at the bottom, and somehow there's an index in between something called a signifier and a signifier. And to be quite frank, I've got absolutely no idea what is happening in this diagram that I got off the internet. You know, somebody is teaching this somewhere, possibly in an American university, and I've got no sense of what's going on with it at all. Okay, and I think a lot of thinking about code is unnecessarily abstruse like this. In our area, the most rigorous explication of code, I think, is that from Umberto Eco. And I can't remember all of these steps, so I'm going to have to read them, and hopefully the microphone will pick this up.
Eco
understands codes as a set of signals ruled by combinatory laws, or a set of states. These could have been conveyed by almost any kind of signal, provided they reach a destination in a form which becomes intelligible. C, a set of behavioural responses at the destination. These can be independent of A and B, how A and B are composed. And D, a rule coupling some items from the A system with some from B and some from C. And I mean, just to cut to the chase, A code says a proper code really is only one that we identify in D. Okay? The others, if you like, and the of course as they sometimes we like weak codes, the S codes, he refers to them in Theory of Semiotics from 1976. Okay. Now I think what A code presents through that notion of code is a version of semiotics which is particularly suited to a kind of cultural anthropology. Okay, and A code's model of communication is thus it's particularly geared, I think, to the old semiotics, but as I hope to show, it yields something new as well. Okay, you're remembering the old semiotics of semiologically influenced semiotics. You get a speech circuit such as this in Saussure as an example of the communication process, and something is impinging upon this speech circuit, something's enabling it to be generated, something in the brain, so it's kind of abstract, but it's also in some respects an objective form, and that objective form Saussure referred to as la langue. Okay, so you get that coded notion in there in the old semiotics, and you get all this work that is devoted to showing how particular instances of parole or particular instances of cultural production are generated in one way or another by an underlying substrate, which is la langue. Okay, I oversimplify, but you know, as a picture of the old semiotics, hopefully it serves. Now, more recently in contemporary semiotics, we've been thinking more often about weak codes and strong codes. Okay, where weak codes are very, very flexible. Okay, strong codes, there must be a very strong relationship between the substrate and that which results from it. Because there's a strong relationship and there's only one way of reading that. I will problematize this, but an idea of the kind of strong codes that we speak about now in semiotics, not all the time, but occasionally, the immune code, the genetic code, the metabolic code, the neural code, digital codes in general. I think particularly of a seminal paper on code duality by Hofmeier and Emmerke, in which they speak about digital kinds of codes and analog kinds of codes, where the digital tend to be very, very strong codes, okay, and analog is usually associated with weak code. Okay, but we will problematize this. In fact, it's Hofmeier and Emmerke that problematize this. As you can see from this slide, Hofmeier is aware of the code duality, obviously, as a co-writer of that paper, but he's orientated towards understanding the vicissitudes of weak coding in particular. Okay, and clearly he's put back on the agenda the need to understand those in the field of biology in biosemiotics. The iterative algorithms that have been processed for this reconstruction of structures from insufficient information actually perform two distinct reconstructions. One for structure and one for storage, okay, which is to say memory. This takes place because organic epigenesis requires organic memories. Third principle. And then finally, the fourth principle, there cannot be a convergent increase of complexity without codes. Organic epigenesis requires organic codes. Okay, so this is a key point for Barbieri, and he says that associated with this are four models. First model, the cell is an epigenetic system made of three fundamental categories, phenotype, and phenotype, which contains at least one organic memory, the genome, and one organic code, the code. Okay? So once again, code and memory. Second model of semantic biology and conclusion is the idea that an animal is a trinitary system made of genotype, phenotype, and phenotype. So that's the second model. Mental development is a sequence of two distinct processes of reconstruction from incomplete information, each of which increases the complexity of the system in a convergent way. The first process builds a speciotypic mind, the universal grammar, while the second leads to the individual mind. This is the third one. And then the emphasis is in the original with the fourth model. He says, the origin and the evolution of life took place by natural selection and by natural conventions. The great events of macroevolution have always been associated with the appearance of new organic codes. So here's a strong code, okay, in a diachronic version. 4 billion years ago, you have the origin of life, okay, the genetic code. 2 billion years ago, you have the eukaryotes. 2 billion years ago, you have the multicellulars. Okay, then 0.5 billion to 0 years ago, animals, vertebrates, amniotes, mammals, cultural evolution, the pattern codes. Okay, and just to give you a sense of complication in this picture, the corollaries I've summarised, and Barbieri mentions these, are the living forms which acquire the new organic code have never driven other forms to extinction. A new organic code has never abolished previous codes. The genetic code is present in all living creatures, but the other organic codes appear in increasingly small groups, thus giving rise to a veritable pyramid of life. And therefore, even if the evolution of an organic code would take an extremely long time, the origin of a complete code is a sudden event. And this means that the great evolutionary novelties associated with that code appeared suddenly in the history of life. Okay, so it seems to cover quite a lot of ground and quite a lot of alternative arguments. But if we were to sum up Barbieri's work, we would say that he suggested that in modern biology, genetic code is seen to appear with the origin of life, and human codes of cultural evolution arrive 4 billion years later. Okay, but with Barbieri, okay, into the breach between these two events come the organic codes. Okay, this series of organic codes with the models and principles that we just identified. Now, if you didn't follow the entire detail of that, it's not a problem. But what he's suggesting is that those organic codes that we spoke about, that they were all, sorry.
Organic code.
Yes, correct. Yes, that they're all strong codes. Okay, so he's finding strong codes at these key points in nature. Okay, so take that as you will. I suppose that the alternative to identifying strong codes in nature is more of an interpretative stance. Now, I should stress in relation to Barbieri that his work is very much about meaning, which we're all interested in the sphere of biological function. Okay? Possibly the issue, as I say, is the strength and immutability of the codes that he's referring to. Okay, so the alternative position perhaps exemplified by the late CBO, is to do with interpretivity. Okay? Because there can be no semiosis without interpretability. Surely life's cardinal propensity. Semiosis presupposes the axiomatic identity of the semiosphere with the biosphere. Okay, I take that as a statement that there are no semiotic entities which you can just say, oh yeah, this is life without meaning. Cole extends this in a series of quotes which I suppose they address Barbieri directly. He says, semiosis has primacy before codes. Codes are products of semiosis. A code can persist after semiosis, in machines, for example, and it's like frozen pragmatic or a frozen habit. The semiosis that makes code relations, the persistence, okay, and reconstruction and inheritance is absolutely necessary. Semiosis cannot exist without codes. Okay? They're a necessary but not sufficient condition for semiosis. And that's why at the end, weak is not something that Phil says, but it's my interpretation of this position. I think it's a tendency towards serious respect for weak coding. Here's another picture of Galilei. Semiosis always requires previous semiosis. Omne semiosis ex semiosis. Omne vivum ex vivo. Except at the initial emergence of the original life. Something must come before coding. Indeed, coding depends for its existence on that something. Okay, so I've argued in this book that's coming out that code really, and you don't hear it said very often, is a kind of anthropomorphism. And in some respects, it's to be anticipated as such in a post-behaviorist world. So, I'd say what is observed as code in nature may be an anthropomorphism, imputing more cryptographic efficiency to an invariant than it warrants. Barbieri considers the issue, and he anticipates it. But he says it doesn't mean that there's not correspondence between two independent worlds. This correspondence must be the result of conscious activity. He rejects that idea. He's saying in this statement something that I think supports strong coding. If we were still in a behaviorist mindset, we would avoid these questions because we would be able to say that all we could record is that this happens and then this happens. We wouldn't impute meaning somehow between those two things. But we are in that universe now. Perhaps we're in a position instead where what is important to us is how the anthropomorphism is somehow negotiated in order to reach the most satisfactory or acceptable conclusion. I note that to interpret in English means two things at the same time. It means to explain the meaning of something and to translate the sense of something. Okay, so it's meaning and translation. Okay, so we could propose an interpretation of semiotics, but that's too much of a binary. You've got code semiotics and interpretation of semiotics. Perhaps we ought to resist that temptation. And I think, again, once more of Umberto Eco, if you consider, and I've often thought about this, his entire career is based around some negotiation of concepts of interpretation and codes, or interpretation versus codes? Is it necessarily a competition? Even in his last book on semiotics, which was published in English in 2014, he was clearly exasperated by the extent to which people were still accusing him of having an interpretivist mentality, insisting that he had introduced the idea that text could be interpreted in any way whatsoever. Again, that there wasn't any notion of inherent meaning. And he rails against that from the Tree to the Labyrinth and says, I never said that at all. And if you look at his pretty famous essay from, I think around about 1990, Interpretation and Over-Interpretation, I wrote about this 20 years ago even. There's a still here that I published from a book on introducing semiotics, and I thought this essay was absolutely pivotal. Eco has this discussion of Renaissance hermetism, and if you can read the text, he draws attention to this example where Hermetists thought that because there was a similar constitution to a certain species of orchid, and it had, as part of its constitution, something that looked like human testicles, they thought that if you conducted an operation on the orchid that was successful, then because of the similarity, it would be successful when you conducted it on human. As I've said in this text above, it could be painful if you followed that idea. And of course, Eco rejects that in favour of a Persian perspective, in which he says, if the operation on the orchis doesn't create a successful habit, then semiosis is failed. Okay, so 2 observations, and you can probably guess the way that I was going if you were paying attention to my emphasis on duality and my emphasis on strong and weak code. Okay, properly strong codes, if they existed, would need to be completely mechanical. I'm thinking of something like Barbier University. Okay, and they would have to be not open to interpretation in the sense of producing anything from the intended result. Okay, so I think we'd all agree with that. But we probably agree too that strong codes can only be identified by way of abductions, which involve experience. And abductions run the risk of being fallible because they're based on experience rather than something mechanical. And they'd be fallible in a way that strong codes are not allowed to be. Okay, so there's a contradiction there. And then there's a further irony. Hoffmeyer and Emmeke pointed this out in the 1991 essay. Digital codes, okay, synonymous with strong codes, things like selfish gene, for example, working all the time in a very efficient way, they've been imputed with an autonomous character, and in fact, their sphere of efficacy is very limited. Okay, so somehow they're independent and like working away from distraction, but no, actually they're in a very limited space. Conversely, analog coding, it's acquired this reputation for independence and individualism, what humans do in culture. But individual humans are subject to species history, are subject to mortality, and are subject to the need to sexually reproduce. Just to name a few subjections. Okay, so conclusions. From my point of view, not all coding is like cryptography. Okay, you probably knew that, but just to reiterate, to make that mistake is brave. Nor is coding in culture identical to the digital codes of nature. There's some discrepancies, some considerable discrepancy between the organic codes Barbier identifies and the way that coding works in culture. However, and I say this with reference to biosemiotics. There are similarities which can't be overlooked. Okay, there's a syntactical variant of endosemiotic digital codes, such as the genetic code, and something like what we understand to be a key component of language there. There's also the fallibility of the genetic code. You know, even in natural selection, there is constant reference to mutation. If something's working perfectly, there won't be mutation. Okay, so there's fallibility in the genetic code, for example. And also there's fallibility in the processes of recognition, memory, categorization, mimicry, learning and communication throughout nature. Okay, and that's continuous, I would argue, with the recognition, memory, categorization, mimicry, learning and communication that occurs in culture. Okay, with the proviso that there must be in those spheres at least some success. Okay, we're not arguing for an absolutely weak coding. There must be some success. Because if there wasn't that success from time to time, then survival of the species would be injected. Okay, so I would add to that, while semiosis involves codes, semiosis doesn't amount to codes. Okay, so one issue I will just raise very briefly, paying tribute to a code once more, refers to coding and memory. Again, I'm being a bit speculative here, but it's a conclusion which, you know, potentially is bleak for humanity as a whole, okay, in the modern and present conjuncture. So with reference to coding and memory, I'm reminded of Aiko's letter to his grandson. Did people see this a few years ago? Aiko wrote a letter to his grandson saying, don't rely on the internet too extensively. Don't rely on using your handheld device for knowledge. Try to memorize things. Try to learn things by rote a little bit. Okay, and the reason that you need to learn things by rote, okay, rather than relying on a code identity to simply deliver knowledge to you, is that you'll get to the end of your life, and if you've relied on those code identities for your knowledge, then you're not going to feel as though you lived. Whereas if you lodge those things in your memory, and he tells you to try and remember the names of football teams, you know, the players on the teams, events in Treasure Island, friends of the Three Musketeers, and so on. So if you don't do that, then you feel as though you haven't lived very much. If you do it, you may feel as though you lived 1,000 lives. So I've written about this recently, and I've called it a kind of warning against the outsourcing of memory. The interesting thing, I think, about this in relation to coding, and also in relation to memory studies, is the instruction to try and memorize by rote. We can't go into this here, but it seems to me to be an alternative perspective to the dominant one about schema, which has been bequeathed to us by cognitive science in particular, as the model of all memorizing. For an association and for a community of people doing semiotics, I think that there are also some other issues that arise from the problem of code. It might be actually that it's the problem not of code, but the problem of continuity as well. Okay. While I said that I would say something synoptic, I'm sorry that I said something negative. There may be some hope, nevertheless, in this. But I think that the challenges for semiotics can be summarized as follows. What do we teach students to do? Okay, if we teach them an over-coded form of semiotics, you know, the sort of thing that I do all the time, frankly, in close reading. We are teaching them something that's like magic and divination. Okay, so in our teaching, we have to develop new methodologies all the time. You know this as well as I know this. We have to develop new methodologies all the time to influence the study of continuity. But in terms of methodology in research, how do you convince funding bodies that you will find out new knowledge unless you say, oh yes, I've discovered a code doing that, and I have a methodology which will provide the answer on every occasion when we encounter this research data. Okay, that's a huge problem for semiotics, and of course, when you're making funding applications, you can either not do semiotics, or if you say that you're going to do semiotics, tell a few lies while you do. Now, obviously, neither of those are good for this community. So, again, we have an issue with methodology. I think the other area which becomes a problem if we are too emphatic about strong coding and somehow characterising the field of semiotics. Then collaboration across cultures, collaboration between researchers in different countries becomes particularly fraught. And we all know the problems of cross-cultural collaboration. But really, as semioticians, we should be in a particularly strong position to negotiate those by developing, as I say again, new methodologies around non-systematic or continuous understandings of semiosis. Thank you.
We have one. I was hoping we might have two, because thank you very much, Paul. That very stimulating.
I'm happy to shout.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah, but I think in terms of there's plenty of time for some questions and contributions from the floor, and I think it might be easier if the person from the floor had one of these temporarily. Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's very good. So, who would like to say or ask?
All this fascinating keynote that in fact gives us keynote for the rest of the symposium. I had the impression that two issues about interpretation merged into your presentation, although they were traditionally separating Umberto Eco's works. On the one hand, Umberto Eco's work, semiotic work, and also method work, insisted a lot on the limits of interpretation. So there is a, let's say, maybe not a rational, but a reasonable way of interpreting text. There is the possibility of intersubjective agreement in a community of interpreters about what a text means, depending on the text, of course. On the other hand, though, Umberto Eco would object most of his career the fact that the constitution of codes in culture and the constitution of codes in nature are somehow commensurable. He would insist, starting from birth, that codes in culture are intrinsically triadic, while codes in nature are intrinsically dyadic. I think that although he was a staunch defender of the idea that we can interpret reasonably in culture, he was also a staunch defender of the idea that what we call codes in nature are, let's say, almost ontologically different from what we call codes in culture. And that was, I think, a pretty, let's say, strong statement in contrast with many trends of contemporary biosemiotics. I'm not saying that I agree with him, but I would want to point out that probably these two, let's say, stances about interpretation in Eco should be kept separated. I don't know if you agree.
No, do I agree? Sorry. Who's the feedback? Is it me or you? So agree with you or agree with Eco?
I mean, if you agree with my own interpretation of Eco's
code.
My interpretation of Foucault's theories of interpretation, I think that the fact that my point is that the fact that he was somehow stressing the fact that interpretation has limits, reasonable limits, shouldn't be mixed, at least in my reading of Foucault, with the idea that somehow we can conflate interpretation of nature and interpretation in culture. And from this point of view, I think Foucault is really a humanist. I would agree on the fact that we can call interpretation what happens in a non-triadic, let's say, unintentional semiotic process.
Okay, it's a really interesting area. We can't do justice to it in a discussion now, so I'll have to produce a couple of responses to that in relation to this paper. I mean, my tribute to Eco is that absolutely this issue about the limits of interpretation. From the tree to the labyrinth, you can sense the exasperation that he's had about the extent to which he's been misunderstood on that issue, and I think that is a lesson to all of us, because if Umberto was exasperated given the position of power that he occupied, what are we going to do? We are infinitely more challenged in many respects. Now, going back to the issue of Coda's dyadic in nature, making you write in your assessment, it makes Eco more of a humanist than, say, people who are involved in contemporary biosemiotics. For example, I know too little about that aspect of Umberto's work. I get the sense that he kept quiet about it. I remember he was put on a platform with Tom Seagiok it must have been the early 90s by somebody in Canada, and the person in Canada that introduced them as Mr. Culture and Mr. Nature, and both of them were furious about this and never forgave the person for doing that. Not that necessarily illustrates an answer to the question whether Eco believed in continuity of semiosis across different realms, natural and cultural, in the way that Tom Seagiok did. But I'm going to put it in your minds and let it be insidious about approaching that point.
Nature, in order to better understand how some cultural processes stemmed from nature. So it was actually a believer in the value of let's say, scientific investigation. But at the same time, I think he disbelieved, or he wasn't a supporter of the idea that, on the contrary, schemes and methodologies that were created to understand culture should be projected on nature. He was in favor of the opposite movement of starting to study nature in order to understand how culture grew out of it. So this was, I think, his point.
Okay. I mean that certainly aligns it more with contemporary biosemiotics, I would say. But it's we should continue work on this, because he's dead, but that work is still very suggestive in this particular area.
Thank you. Thank you for your address. I turn back to one of your punctual ideas about fallible digital codes, that sometimes codes don't work. And my question is it the code as such that doesn't work, or it's the situation as such that the code doesn't work particularly well in that particular situation? So I turn back to something that is somehow missing in your presentation, and I'd like to know your opinion about that. Well, people in semiotics also speak about encoding and decoding. And what's the relation of code with these two processes, and if this kind of fallibilism of codes could be dissociated in each of the two stages with some form of, productivity?
Okay, well, I'll try and address the second part of what you said first, because that's slightly easier, because it refers to weak coding, or I'm going to make it refer to weak coding anyway, because in the sphere of culture we have all sorts of weak codings and we have all sorts of encodings and decodings that take place on that terrain of weakness. So I think that we're in agreement there. But the early part of your statement about the fallibility of digital codes, it reminds me that there's a basic contradiction in this paper in terms of the evidence that I've presented in order to try and deconstruct the duality of strong and weak codes, especially in nature. And it's this: I say that the digital codes are fallible on the one hand, but in a sense I'm contradicting myself by saying that they're also an anthropomorphism. You know, if we were behaviorists about this, as I said before, what the so-called digital codes do is one thing, and then something else happens, and all that we can observe is those two things. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is now. I'm going to have to rewrite this paper, which is good. This is what question and answer sessions are for. I gave a paper in Cyprus, and one syllable was missing from the title of the paper, so I have to retitle it after questions from the audience, and I think I'll have to do the same with eradicating that contradiction in this paper.
Thank you. We have time for one more contribution or question.
It's indeed your very illustrative presentation. It is important also to remember that there are two domains. One is physical domain and another is logical. So semiosis, for example, encoding is going beyond the logical domain, because in the physical domain you may withdraw elements as constituents, physical entities, and those which belong to the logical domain, the combination of finite and abstraction, etc. Aspects of logic.
Okay, so physical versus logical, physical and logical don't necessarily have to set up a competition.
I think that you mentioned better constituents and essence in that particular.
Well, lurking behind this, for me, I didn't go into it in this paper, is always this idea that apparently has come from the late Latins, but it's been interpreted for us and promulgated for us by John Dealey, and it's the idea of relation.
Relation, exactly. And the relation belongs to the logical domain, because we have combined.
Indeed. Indeed. And as I say, that's another area which we could open up this perspective. You know, these are things I think we should talk about in the coming years.
Well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your contributions, and particularly fascinating lecture. I mean, in my mind, one of the things I'm most concerned about is whether all semiotic systems are open systems, and therefore how we look at these semiotic deciding. And that was very, very useful to me. But there are many, many other ways in which it would be useful. So thank you very much.